Tonight, today, tonight, and for this last week, many people around the world have been weeping. Weeping for the people of Ukraine, weeping for friends who are Ukrainian, people within Ukraine, people fleeing Ukraine, weeping. What caught my eye in this text from Joel that I don't think I had seen before is that the priests are literally commanded to weep. It says from the vestibule to the altar. In other words, from the front lobby to the communion table, they should be weeping. And it's not a usual image we have, at least that I have, of the priest. Usually it's of them holding the sacrament or in the Protestant tradition preaching. But here it says, Joel the prophet says, the priests ought to weep as they come from the front lobby up to the communion table. And I really think it's written in the idea, in the headset, that the priests, as they often were, are the representatives of the people. That the people are weeping. There's intense, immense sadness in the community. And so the priests gather that together. And not everyone can weep. I mean, all of us weep at different things, at different moments, even when facing the same loss, the same bereavement. But here the priests are commanded by the prophet to come before God and weeping on behalf of, but I think also for the people and for the nation. It caught my eye also this week. There was an interview with British Columbia Premier John Horgan. And he was commenting about the occupation of Ottawa by the truckers and what he called the loss of civil discourse and civil disagreement. But what really caught my attention was he said at the end of that interview, "I weep for our future." I mean, most politicians are trained by their communications, their comms experts, to say positive things. And he ends this by saying, in response to this loss that we've experienced in this country, I weep for our future. Joel, the prophet, is weeping for the nation. This terrible day of the Lord is coming. And even in sort of minimal Old Testament 101, the day of the Lord is something you don't want to come. You don't want to be there when it happens, because devastation occurs. And so Joel is saying there's going to be weeping because it's going to be so awful. It's going to be so terrible for you. And why? Because of all your unfaithfulness, because you haven't treated widows and orphans rightly, you haven't trusted in God, you trusted in the Egyptians and not God, and on go the list of things that really have made God think the only way I can cleanse the nation, the only way I can turn them in the right direction is by bringing in the day of the Lord. And so the response is, oh my gosh, it's going to be so awful, all I can do is weep. Even the priests are commanded to weep. And certainly, we have lived as citizens not only of the city and the country and of this planet. We weep for what's happened in our own city, what's happening in the world at this moment, for the incredible, for example, climate change that is coming, and yet how responsive our governments and peoples. We weep. There are so many things. The racism which is inherent in our cultures, the ageism. We weep. We weep for all these things, for all these people. And so the priests are commanded to weep. I had a parishioner way back when I was at Bell's Corners, and She was a single parent, but her daughter had moved out, wouldn't communicate with her. It was just a terrible situation. And she told me when I visited her, you know, when I come to church, I do nothing but weep, and so I don't want to come to church. And I said to her, at some stage in the conversation, I said, you know, there's kind of like over in this area, there's always an empty place, a spot. Like, for whatever reason, nobody wants to sit over there on Sundays. Why don't you go there and cry all you want? Because, I'm fine with it. I'll see you, but you hang out there and cry. And if you're comfy, stay. And then this transformation happened. Other people who really needed to weep when they came to church began moving over to that section. And there was kind of like a safe spot for people to weep. And it was amazing. It was the Spirit at work. So in the text you heard, and I think this is, traditional Lent as I've known it, perhaps you've known it, that when the prophet says, how do we return to the Lord? With what do we come? How do we do it so that we can turn things around so there isn't this devastating day of the Lord? And the first one, of course, is fasting. And that's the way I traditionally thought of Lent. My best buddy was Anglican. Every year he gave up something. I worked with a colleague who, for whatever reason, he gave up coffee, and he was in a terrible mood for the whole of Lent, but he gave it up. Really. But that was my image. But in the second thing, it says, return to the Lord with weeping. With weeping. Who knew that was in the text? Who knew that that's what the prophet was saying? You can bring that to God for this season. So somehow to transform this, that forget fasting this year. Bring your tears, because they're legit. The prophet is saying your weeping is a legitimate. In fact, God asks you to bring your weeping to God so that we, as a community, as a world, might be turned around and get headed in the direction of righteousness. I checked because I had this idea that in the Judaic traditions there were periods set aside for mourning after great loss. And the most common one that probably we know popularly in popular cultures, the Shiva, for the first 7 days, when you literally isolate yourself from everyone else and everything else. And so you sit Shiva for those 7 days and don't go out, don't go to work, don't have communications. You weep for those 7 days. But following that is this 30-day period called Sheloshim. So for 30 days, it actually says in the law, you may go to work. You may have contacts with others, but you ought to come home each day and weep and grieve your loss for those 30 days. And then in some fashion, it continues for 1 year, and then there's a special ceremony remembrance on the 1-year anniversary of whatever the loss is that you're remembering. But so it's built into that tradition. So perhaps, I don't know how, but in your own experience and time of Lent this year, it may be a time to bring not only your fasting, if you wish, but to bring your weeping and to offer it to God, literally, for not only the healing of yourself, but for the healing of the nation. May God be our guide. Amen.